Okay.
This is a sermon for Trinity 6. It's about a parable. What about parables? What are they driving at? Several parables are taken from the Old Testament, the sheep and the shepherd, about Israel and his king. The vine and the vineyard, again the image of Israel. So Jesus' parables are not totally new. Their message sounds in some way very familiar, yet they have new twists, uncomfortable within the familiarity. And that is the heart of a parable. Jesus was articulating a new way of understanding the fulfillment of Israel's hopes. They invite Jesus' listeners into a new world, encouraging them to make that world their own, not just as spectators. The struggle to understand a parable is the struggle for a new world to be born. A parable often has a double-edged message of welcome and warning. The parables are not simply information about the kingdom, but a part of the means of bringing it about. They do not merely give us something to think about, they invite us into the new world that is being created and warn of dire consequences if the invitation is refused. Allow us to pull out a few... This parable is concerned with final judgment, which will usher in the kingdom of God. This judgment is compared to a separation. Before the separation, good and bad are mixed. The idea of a premature separation is rejected, and patience until the harvest is required. Why is such patience necessary? Jesus gives two reasons. First, people are not capable of carrying out the separation effectively. They may pull out the wheat at the same time as the tares. And secondly, in the early stages of growth, the tares and the wheat resemble each other. Then where did the tares come from? The answer is definite. There is no doubt whatsoever. It was the deliberate deed of an enemy. The servants, eager to cooperate, say, "Allow us to pull out the tares before they do any more harm." But if they were pulled out before the wheat was fully ripe, it would mean a complete loss of the wheat. Grow both together before the harvest. The difference between the wheat and the tares would be more apparent at harvest time, and the wheat would still serve its useful purpose. At harvest time, the reapers will first gather the tares and burn them up, and then very carefully gather the wheat and bring it to the proper place in the barn or granary. This parable teaches us that there is always a hostile power in the world, seeking and waiting to destroy the good seed. Our experience is that both kinds of influence act upon our lives. The influence which helps the seed of the word to flourish and grow, and the influence which seeks to destroy the good seed before it can produce fruit at all. The lesson is that we must be forever on our guard. The parable teaches us how hard it is to distinguish between those who are in the kingdom and those who are not. We are much too quick to classify people and label them good or bad without knowing all the facts. So what we have to learn is that the good and bad are mixed. So the point of the parable to me is that mixed we have to be to learn to share. The Christian gospel needs to be lived and it needs to be shared. You want to follow Christ, you don't want to look back. Remember, and I quote, that as you walk in his footsteps, you will be irresistibly drawn to share and find a great simplicity of life. We all know it is not easy to live together in community, loving your neighbour as yourself. We all need to know how easy it is to spot the weeds in other people, but in doing so, we turn sacred space into gated privilege and freedom into the desire to manipulate or control. Root out in yourself all that would knock back the spirit of another. We all should be open to where failures and shame cease and where wounds are healed. We each come with our own wounds, carrying the scars in our bodies and branded in our memories. Was it not in those pierced and wounded places, though, that the seed of God's wheat were planted to grow? The good God sows his seed, even though he knows it will get tangled up with evil and sin. This never puts him off. His goodness overcomes all evil, and out of his love he continues to sow the seed. But what about all this judgment, all those thrown into the blazing furnace? We're all aware of stuff that happens when things muck up, with our enduring tendencies to get things wrong and sometimes to be downright evil. Which of us is not aware of our own mixed motives and falls from grace? But sin is much more than evil deeds. It is the mystery of our lack of response to God's unconditional love. Sin is rather like a disease which we can pick up in the particular circumstances of our own history. But like COVID-19, it is not my fault that I pick it up, but I do need to take responsibility and go to the doctor to avoid passing on the epidemic. God sees us as the whole being he wants to create, and waits for the day when human souls mature, so that evil and sin will no longer hinder one's life. Remember, God, out of his love, continues sowing, despite all the negative interventions. God uses imperfections to achieve God's true perfection. God uses weakness to create strength. God uses humans to create sons and daughters of God. Being human means to be imperfect, to be limited, and thus to change and travel on a particular journey. Mature spirituality gives us the ability to live joyfully in an imperfect world. The wheat and the tares grow together. So Jesus describes by his parables a new exodus, a new world, a new creation. His parables continue the long Jewish tradition of telling the story of Israel herself. And finally, the parable functions as an urgent summons, which attempts to break open the worldview of the present listeners and replace it with a new one, with God at the centre.